I'm speaking with Somaiya Daud, author of Court of Lions, a Mirage novel, published, or to be published, August 4th, 2020 by Flatiron Books. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
So first, of the many ideas that writers have, including yourself, how did this particular idea rise up above the rest to get written?
It was really like, I wanted to write a book, and I love Star Wars. I am one of the few people that really loves the prequel trilogy, especially the first movie. I really love the idea of a queen having a body double, and I really, I think the year before I wrote it, I went to the traveling costume exhibit that Star Wars, that like Lucasfilm had put out, because it was at the Mopop in Seattle, and all of the costumes had these little like plaques that were like, the costume designer pulled it from this culture in Asia, or this culture in Africa, or like this idea from the Ottoman Empire, and there are like almost no brown people in Star Wars. So it was really a confluence of things, and I sort of like write to where whatever has the strongest pull. And this was the one that just like I had been actually like, I'd started my graduate program, and I'd been struggling to write anything to completion for a while, which was like a really scary feeling for me. And this one just sort of stuck. Yeah.
And I see that the series itself, it's described as sort of, in Amazon, it falls under like folk tales, and it's described as fantasy, but it also has a space element to it. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So I describe it as a space fantasy, which like is what I think of when I think of Star Wars. So something that has like a really heavy political intrigue aspect, something that is like concerned with history, that's concerned with relationships over technology. But I am also really obsessed with the idea of like brown futurity, and like what does it look like when we imagine cultures that are not Western cultures transforming and evolving and moving into the future, right? So like for me, it's really important that Mirage is a Moroccan space fantasy that imagines like a Moroccan culture terraforming multiple moons, right? And developing all of this technology, and how that technology becomes embedded in a society that is allowed to hold on to its cultural history. Because I get a lot of readers who are very like, I don't really understand like why all of this old timey stuff is still in it. Like, why are all of these old timey clothes? And I have to be like, Moroccans still dress like this. Like, this is what we still wear to like celebrations, right? Just because you don't see it or you don't know it because you're not familiar with the culture or whatever doesn't make it any less true. And there's this like really strange idea that like the West has completely modernized and completely left the past behind, but we have like all of these antiquated traditions that don't really make any sense. Like 4 or 5 years ago, we all watched a Prince of England get married. Like monarchy is sort of the oldest, most antiquated tradition, and watching a dude who basically does not have a job spend billions of dollars on a wedding is absurd. But no one would say like that's not, like, why is that part of our, or, I mean, there are criticisms, obviously, like, why is that part of our modern landscape? But the criticisms become much more pointed because the West thinks of non-Western cultures as being, like, historically bound, like, none of them moved into the future. And so I really wanted to challenge that with this book, and thinking about, like, imagine a world in which brown people got to develop, like, got to assert their cultural dominance and express themselves into the future. What traditions would they keep? The answer is most of them. And how would technology be folded into those traditions and into that landscape?
So what's the name of the culture that sort of stands in for Moroccan culture in the series?
The Kushela is really the most Moroccan adjacent one. That's pulling. My mother is Shlouhi, so that's like an indigenous ethnic group in Morocco, and so those are the cultural traditions that I'm most familiar with, and the ones that are pulling most heavily, or that are pulled most heavily into the book.
Now, does the book, is it sort of an extension of Earth, humanity going out into space, or is it completely separate from sort of human society in your setting?
It's completely separate. So these people have never heard of Earth. They don't know what an Earth is.
Okay. Okay, so tell me more about the in details without any spoilers. Tell me about the protagonist and more about the conflict that exists.
Yeah, so Amani is the main character, and she is an 18-year-old girl who is living on Cadiz, which is the moon that's orbiting the main planet Andala, and she's living about 20 years after the conquest wave. So 20 years ago, the Vathic Empire rolled in and conquered the moons and the planet and installed an imperial regime. And as part of the concession of loss, the planet's reigning queen married the Vathic emperor to give him control, like to give him legal control over the planet. And so Amani is living in the after of all of this, and her parents and her eldest brother have all survived the conquest wave. And on her coming of age majority night, she is kidnapped to the imperial palace to be the body double for the imperial princess, who actually looks exactly like her. And so she gets pulled into the imperial palace politics and is sort of forced to contend with like the real ramifications of what the conquest is, and is forced to answer the question, like, what can I do in the face of colonial oppression, and in the face of a very, very powerful empire that is hell-bent on our destruction.
Mm-hmm. Is it more action or more political, or
it's definitely more political. Like I'm a writer that enjoys writing relationships and dialogue over action montages. Mm-hmm. Which is just like a skill that I haven't mastered. And so, yeah, it's definitely more politically driven. There's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of tense relationships and tense relationship conflicts. And all of the stakes are sort of bound up in the relationships that the characters have with one another. Yeah.
So now I see, so the book is young adult and it says, 8, or actually it said grade 8 and up. And I'm just curious, with this serious subject matter, in what ways, were there ways in which you had to sort of pull back, like some strong concepts for the age group, or did you hold back at all in any way? Or
I didn't really. There was like a conversation with my editors sometimes where they were like, I don't think readers will understand this, but I was a very precocious reader when I was in high school. Like I read The Wheel of Time when I was in high school in like 4 months. And so I always try to assume the best of the teenage reader, because I was a reader at that age who really wanted to be challenged and who was bored really easily, and didn't like to be talked down to. The other thing too is that like I think that there's a sort of precious idea of what like the average teenager is, and there are plenty of teens who have like escaped war-torn countries or lived under occupation or are living with the after effects of their parents who have lived under occupation, and I don't want to write a watered down version of that experience. Like that's unfair to them, if I had ever felt like I had needed to pull back on the experience of these characters in order to make it more palatable to the young audience, then it's definitely something that like I shouldn't have written. And I tried to be as emotionally honest and authentic as possible as I was writing, like to ask the hard questions and to ask what the experiences of this character would be like. And sometimes there was a little bit of like editorial pushback, but in the end, I think I landed in a place that feels emotionally real without having to undermine like the actual lived realities that the book is pulling on.
Mm-hmm. So as far as sort of the cultural and political aspects, did you have to do any additional research for the book, or were you?
Yeah. So I actually did a lot of research into the years of lead, which are the 1960s to 1980s in Morocco. So after Morocco asserts its independence, there is like a move to ethnically unify the country, which is difficult because it has like many separate ethnic groups who all have their own distinct traditions, cultures, and languages. So there's like not even really like linguistic unity in Morocco, even though technically Arabic is like the state language. And so in order to force this sort of unified identity, there is a regime of Arabization, and so it's like a deliberate attempt by the government to wipe out ethnic difference and wipe out indigeneity as a concept, right? And so a lot of people were imprisoned, like a lot of poets, a lot of political writers. There's also like a socialist movement that happens during this time, and it's like a really awful, really terrible time where people are like spirited away off to black site prisons and all of this other stuff. And so I drew on that a lot in terms of thinking about what it's like living in a state where the government is deliberately trying to wipe your culture out and pull you into the dominant cultural structure. Like, what does that look like? How does that feel? What are the consequences of it? And so I read a lot of like dissident magazines. I read a lot of history. I read a lot of poetry that was written in the area during that era. And I also like did a lot of like oral history research with like my mom, who was born in the 60s and sort of lived through that, through that movement. Yeah.
I'm speaking with Somaiya Daud, author of Court of Lions. You can find more information on her work at somaiyabooks.com. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. You can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. And now back to the podcast. Now, did you do all this research before writing it, or was it during the writing and it affected how any plot lines or anything?
It was a little bit of both. Like, I was doing a lot of reading. Like, I was a grad student while I was writing the first book, and so I had access to stuff, and they were things that I was already interested in, and I had already known a little bit of it because my mother lived through that time period, and so I had a sense of it. And then I just, as I was writing, I got more concrete information that helped to fill out the book tremendously, and it also underwent like pretty serious revisions the first round. So like the more I read, the more I could fill out different parts of it.
Mm-hmm. So it seems I would imagine it's pretty unsympathetic to the conquering regime within your book. But yeah. Do you have sympathetic characters within that regime?
Yeah, so the most sympathetic character is Maram, who is the half Kushela, half Bathic daughter of the emperor, and is slated to be the imperial heir in the first book. And she's pretty sympathetic, but she's also only sympathetic because she is biracial. And so her conflict and her real difficulty is like trying to figure out if she can actually risk her skin for her mother's people and for her family members that are her disenfranchised family members, right? She's 17 or 18. The only thing that she wants in the world is to please her father, but her father is a fascist dictator. And she has a lot of trouble being able to separate those two things out, and also understanding that like the risk of failure, like if she fails in her father's eyes, like the cost is death, right? Mm-hmm. And so she's a sympathetic character in the regime, but she's also only sympathetic because she has this conflict. And I think that I was talking to a friend about this. I was like, I think that if Maram was just a straight up Vathic conqueror, like the conflict is not there, right? The risk that she's taking, Maram's risk is that she's already seen as lesser and as a compromise because she's biracial. And so that risk becomes much, much higher for her, right? Like the expectation of failure is already there and she's already walking on thin ice. But I generally, the stance of the book and Amani's stance, the main character stance, is generally that like if you are part of the oppressor class, you have a duty to stand up against it. And if you're not standing up against it, then you failed morally as a human being. Mm-hmm.
It's pretty fascinating that that you use sort of the Arabic Empire as the conqueror, as quote the bad guys in the book. Are there any other fantasy books out there or that sort of use it the same way you have, or have you approached it from an angle others really haven't before?
Well, the Vathic Empire is not Arab. I used the Moroccan years of lead as like a template for it because it was the closest that I could get to. It was the thing that was most interesting to me about trying to think about indigenous oppression. But the Vathic are very much like sort of European Roman-esque in that sense. But no, I think in terms of using indigenous oppression in Morocco as a template for thinking about empire and thinking about colonialism in books, I don't think so. Morocco doesn't really get a lot of, outside of being as a sort of like exotic proto-fantasy historical backdrop. It doesn't really get a lot of play in fantasy. And I'm not really terribly sure if I'm grateful for that or annoyed by it, just because, like, part of the struggle of the research and part of the privilege that I had is that I can speak Arabic, and I do also have access to academic resources because I'm at a university. And just like looking at the resources that I looked at, they're really expensive and really inaccessible to the average person. And so like I think that is a huge roadblock. And like most people, I tell people at like book signings and stuff like that, if you want to write about a niche subject where the material is just too expensive for you, like if you email a scholar, they are so happy to help you. They're like, oh my God, someone cares about this niche topic that I've been talking about for 20 years. But a lot of people just don't, because they just think of it as like this space where it's difficult to have access to. And then universities don't really make alumni access really transparent in terms of the databases and stuff like that. So there's just a lot of roadblocks to being able to do good research on these things that are generally thought of as specialty topics. Like most books on the history of conquest in North Africa or the literary history of North Africa and Muslim Iberia are just like, they're just so difficult to get a hold of. And a lot of them are out of print, or a lot of them are only sold in hardcover, and the ebooks are like $200. Like there are all of these sort of institutional barriers to being able to get information if you're a person who's existing outside of academia that I was lucky not to have in my path just because I was a grad student at the time.
So I see in your bio, and if it's correct, that you have an interest in Arabic poetry and the cosmos.
Yeah.
And so how much of that, it sounds like a fair amount did, but can you elaborate more on how much of that made its way into the series?
Yeah, so poetry is like a pretty big cornerstone in terms of the world building, just simply because Arabic speaking spaces in the Middle Ages and Arabic literature in general, its foundation is poetry, not prose. And so there are like hundreds of genres of poetry. And when I was world building the world for Mirage, I was like, okay, if I'm going to make this Moroccan inspired, then I have to also think about the literary scene, right? They can't be reading novels, because the novel evolved in the 19th century in Europe under very, very specific cultural conditions, which were not present in the rest of the world, or not, at least not present in the way that we think of them. And so for Arabs, or for Arabic-speaking countries, rather, the novel only comes in after colonialism, right? Before then, and really until now, poetry is the preferred mode. It is the mode of high art. And so I thought a lot about, like, Amani as someone who is desperate to have, like, a real connection to her culture pre-conquest. And one of the ways that she does that is through poetry, which is something that is, like, being actively suppressed. Right, her brother, in the opening chapters, her brother gives her like contraband poetry that she keeps with her and hides because she knows if it's discovered, it'll be destroyed. And I also, for me, was, especially in the first book, an interesting way to bring in like women, just because oftentimes, because I teach Arabian Nights to my students sometimes, and it's always like they always come with these preconceived notions about like how women were treated and what their rights were in like the nebulous Middle East in the Middle Ages or whatever, with no actual knowledge of like their rights or their presence in history or how they're recorded in the archive. And so it was, for me, it's like a great opening point to have like these like really amazing women poets who are operating in the Middle Ages, who are audacious and saucy and like totally and completely unafraid, to have them embedded as a sort of guide mark or rubric for the sort of personhood that Amani could embody as she moved through the story. And so they became really, really important. And I think for a lot of English language readers, like poetry is just not, it's really something that like our eyes glaze over. Like it's something that we had to do in high school, that we had to read in high school in like high school English, but it's not really like, we don't think of it as like engaging or entertainment. And so I was really conscious of that too when I was selecting the poetry and thinking about like, okay, you have to select poetry that the scene won't make sense without it. Like if a reader skips over the lines of poetry that are recited, they have to go back to understand what's actually happening in the scene. And so that was really fun and a really interesting challenge to make sure that they were as deeply embedded in the emotional landscape of the characters and the scene as possible.
Mm-hmm. How much does religion make its way into the novels? Is there sort of any Islamic elements or Moroccan approach to Islam in the books?
So there is religion, but I was actually really conscious of like not putting Islam in the novel just because it's really interesting because I get readers who are like, oh, they're all Muslim. And I'm like, they're not. Like they literally cannot be because the conditions under which Islam gets formed on our planet don't exist out there. But it was really important for the characters, for me to have the characters have a faith tradition simply because like I think that like authentic real world building includes building in faith traditions into it, and not having a faith tradition means that you're like a bad fantasist and a bad world builder because you can't imagine a culture in which like at some point in their evolution they tried to explain the world around them, and they do that through faith, through ways of like literalizing events or creating metaphors or explanations for why things happen, right? Like that's why faith exists. We're trying to make sense of the universe and the world around us in a way when it like can't make sense to us, right? And so I think a lot of people assume because I'm Muslim and because the characters are sort of like space Moroccans that they have to be Muslim. But I like really, their prophet is a woman. We don't have female prophets in Islam, and their god is called something else. And it's really just like that she has a faith tradition, and that's a really important like community and cultural touchstone for her. And for many people under occupation, religion becomes a way in which they can form solidarity with other people who are under conquest. And so it becomes a through line through which like a rebellion can form and revolution can happen, and solidarity can happen. And it's less about sort of the representational aspects of Islam or anything like that. And so like even with the scripture that happens in it, it's poetic because the mode of literature for them is poetry. And so that's the sort of the shape that it takes and the form that it takes.
Okay. So we've touched on some of the things that inspire you, some of the things you enjoy. Can you talk about other books, music, TV, anything like that just generally inspire your creative mind?
Yeah, I love science fiction. That comes as no surprise to anybody, I think. I love any science fiction that has like a political intrigue aspect to it, so I really loved watching. I just binged The Expanse over Christmas break. That was really fun. Okay. I really, really love sci-fi, like the channels, really campy sci-fi dramas. So like I really love Killjoys. Like that just finished, and that was like one of the best sci-fi experiences I've ever had. Let's see, I read a lot of fantasy. I'm a huge Tolkien fan, which I think surprises a lot of people. But I just think he's such a fabulous world builder. And I think a lot of people like misread the Silmarillion and the point of the Silmarillion. Mm-hmm. And so they come away, like the entire genre is sort of founded around this idea that like there has to be a quest for a magical item. And I think that Tolkien was more interested in like intergenerational trauma and grief. Mm-hmm. And those things get completely like put to the side.
Interesting. And
in terms of music, I listen to a lot of like lo-fi chill hip beats to study and read.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this question kind of expands on the one I just asked, which is how about stuff outside of sort of genre entertainment? And you have the poetry that you're interested in, other stuff in general that just inspires you.
I like reading science articles about space. That's always really fun. Mm-hmm. I love reading comics. It's always interesting to sort of think about how narrative has to transform into the visual medium, and so that's always really fun. I really just kind of stay in my wheelhouse. Like I don't read a lot of contemporary. The nonfiction, I read a lot of like history nonfiction that gets like I have like a running Word document where like any interesting historical moments I like write down as a potential like plot egg that can launch something. Yeah, that's basically it. I don't do a lot.
Well, it's I don't want to say you do a lot, but it's within, like you say, your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Is there a third book slated for the series?
No, Court of Lions is the final one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a duology.
Okay. What would you say is if the book had a soundtrack, or what would you say the aesthetic of the two books are?
Oh, I listened to a lot of John Williams' Star Wars soundtrack when I was writing it, and also I had this one song on repeat called Epitaphio, which is an Andalusian song. I can't remember the artist's name or the singer's name. I'm gonna look it up right now.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
So it's by Luis Delgado, and so he takes a lot of like Andalusian Arabic poetry and then puts it to music, and so the entire album is really great. But Epitaphio is really wonderful because it's talking about like this one person who has survived all of his friends. So it's an epitaph, basically. And I listened to that a lot when I was writing Court of Lions. Yeah.
Interesting. Is there anything that you consider out of the ordinary as far as completing drafts or your work?
No, I think I had a pretty long editorial process for a variety of reasons. But in terms of completing it, that was pretty standard. Like I finished it and sent it off.
Okay. So between the first book and this book, has there been any changes to your approach to writing?
I've become a lot more confident. Like the first book was very much me figuring out what I was capable of doing under contract, because it's a completely different environment when you're writing for yourself versus what you're writing under contract. And so for Mirage, I was still figuring out like what I'm capable of, what a reader's going to respond to, what I'm actually good at. And so when I came to Court of Lions, I felt a lot more confident about like what I could do and what I was capable of, and a lot more interested in challenging myself as a writer. Like Court of Lions has a larger cast of characters that has more dynamic relationships. There's more to keep track of. And I really wanted to do that because I wanted the world to feel, Amani's world in the first book is very small. Like she knows and talks to like 3 or 4 people. And I wanted the reader to have a sense of this much broader world and this much larger chessboard that she was going to be playing on for Court of Lions. And so it was really fun to take up that challenge, to say like, this is what I want to do. And then to watch myself do it, even if I struggled during certain parts of it.
Right. So as far as the editing, did you overwrite and have to cut out a lot, or no spoilers, obviously, but
I actually underwrote. The first couple of drafts were very like, when I had like an editor change halfway through, and so when Kate Sullivan came on, she was like, you just don't have enough. Like that's the problem. You don't have enough of these relationships. You're not grounding these characters in these places and in these relationships well enough. And so I had to write a lot more just to like accommodate, because there's only so much space in a book, and if you have a lot of characters, like you have to make sure that every scene that they're in is going to stick with the reader. And so there was a lot of making sure that like the moments in which they occurred were memorable for them, so that you could remember these characters when they reappear later on, and why they're important, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of like sort of doing that. And I'm a writer who gets sort of like lost in the trees rather than the forest, or however that phrase goes. And so there were a lot of things where like Kate was like, okay, you don't, like, nobody cares about this. Like, I'm someone who would totally take a 2-page diversions to, like, explain funerary rites to a reader, and Kate would have to be like, nobody cares about this. This is not relevant to the plot. Get rid of it.
Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah. So a bit of a whimsical question, and I sort of can suspect an answer, but when you were younger, was there any power technology or fictional setting you yearned for or to be a part of?
I wrote so much Lord of the Rings fan fiction when I was a kid. So, yeah. Yeah, and I also wrote Star Wars fan fiction. So those were the two. I either wanted to be a Jedi or an Elvish princess, which I feel like is really a stereotypical answer, but no less true for me.
So so considering Tolkien, there are many ages. Were you in the standard age, or was there a different age you wanted to be in?
When I was a kid, it was just the third age, because that was what I knew. And I only read the Silmarillion as an adult. And so now I'm like all about the first age. And I'm really pissed that nobody wants to take on the challenge of doing a first age show, because it's the most dynamically interesting to me. And it's also the one that I think, like, in terms of how interesting and inclusive can it be without leaning into Tolkien's racism, I feel like the first age is the one to do that. And the second age is really iffy, because there's a lot of like I feel like that's where Tolkien's like weird race stuff comes in most clearly. But yeah, I love the first age. I think it's And I think Tolkien would agree, even though he's dead, that like the first age is really sort of the like thematic and narrative bedrock of his entire legendarium, and it's really about like grief and trauma and like the inescapability of both. Mm-hmm. And I find those really, really, really interesting as a writer who's like interested in like memory and cultural legacy and what the people who come after have to do to deal with that.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I'm going to do some more personal research on what you just described. Do some more reading on that, if there's much out there.
I think that there is some, but like most people just like don't want to read the Silmarillion because it's really dense. But so for me, sorry, I just gave a class on this. I gave a lecture, so I like inoculated a bunch of students with this is how you read the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. But for me, like the reason, like in modern fantasy, elves are sort of just like cutesy, pointy-eared like druids, and I think for Tolkien he has elves because they're immortal, because then they can be these like receptacles of memory. So like you can't actually escape the past when you're an elf. You're like constantly circling back to it. There's not a way for you to escape trauma, especially if you're part of the wave of the Naldor that made it over to Middle Earth and then get locked in purgatory as a punishment for their rebellion and for their taking part in the kinslayings. And so I think that like when you approach the Lord of the Rings, having not read the Silmarillion, you're just kind of like, why are all of these elves here? And also, why are they all like leaving? Like, why are none of them actually invested in this like huge problem? And it's because they all have depression. And they're all like they've all survived like multiple cataclysmic events. And I think that like one of the most interesting things about the Lord of the Rings and the way that it gets read is that it gets read as like a veneration of like a feudal medieval landscape, when it's actually like post-apocalyptic fiction, because they've undergone, in the first age, Beleriand sinks, the entire coastline sinks, and then in the second age, Numenor sinks, and there's like a tsunami. And so like to me it's really interesting, and Peter Jackson really knew this, because like the movies have all of these ruins, and you don't have ruins in a society that's like capable of organizing their cultural history, and like all of these kingdoms are like totally incapable of doing that because they're grappling with apocalypse, and then like the shadow of like a third apocalypse that's about to be upon them. And so I think that makes all of the like internal like character motivations and conflicts much more interesting, because you're dealing with a society that's like never been allowed to recover from multiple forms of apocalypse and multiple forms of trauma. And then also on top of that, like the elvish race, those of them that are left are ones that have also never gotten therapy and never been allowed to recover, and they also have the threat of like purgatory hanging over them because they're part of this like ongoing curse that occurs in the first age. And like none of that really gets talked about as being, because I don't think that that's like the legacy of the Lord of the Rings in fantasy, but to me it's the most interesting aspect of Tolkien's work. Like I don't care about the MacGuffins or whatever. I care about like when Elrond at the Council of Elrond is like, here is a list of all of the bad things that happened to me, and also my brother died, you know? And like, it's interesting and telling to me that like that also gets cut out of the movie, because if you don't read the Silmarillion, then like you don't actually know what he's talking about. Like when he mentions the host of the Valar and, you know, the armies of Beleriand, like you have no idea what that is, because it's also not part of the map anymore. It's gone. Sorry. I literally could talk about this forever.
So when are you publishing the book on this subject? When is that coming out?
I actually want to do a podcast, like a mini series of like 5 episodes where I do this, and I test drove it with my students, and they were really receptive. So maybe soon, hopefully before the new Lord of the Rings show airs.
Oh yeah. Though that might be delayed because of all the production delays. Yeah. So you have time, which isn't good. You know, that gives you too much leeway there. I'd rather get this out as quickly as possible. Yeah. I'm speaking with Somaiya Daud, author of Court of Lions. You can find more information on her work at somaiyabooks.com. If you like this podcast so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please go to my website, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com for links to news, videos, new books, and my social media links. You can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. And now back to the podcast. Were there any other difficulties in finishing the book? You said it was a long editorial, or the second book in the series.
Yeah, it was just, there was a sort of difference in editorial vision that sort of came to a head. And so it just took a little bit longer because I think the editors that I had, like, clearly I'm like a deep fantasy reader and writer, and I don't think anyone that was on the editorial team really was that. And so there were a lot of like, well, you don't really need this, and I'd have to be like, I don't know how to explain to you how world building works, but actually, like, yes, I do need that, because if I get rid of that, then I have to get rid of like 6 other things, and then there's no book.
So it sounds like you were writing high space fantasy, and it kind of got trimmed down a little bit. Yeah, and I'm super happy with the version that's being released, because I think it does what it needs to do very well. But I also did that with a different editor who was a fantasy reader. And who had the same taste that I did. Interesting. So what's your next writing project?
Hopefully, what I'm currently working on now is a big giant space fantasy that's trying to pull all of the stuff that I said about memory and apocalypse into a narrative form that's fun. So we'll see how that goes.
Is that planned for young adult or more?
No, for adults. I've realized I would really like to go ham with world building.
Okay.
So I think it's going to be like an adult space fantasy.
Cool. So, where can people find you online? You have a website, social media?
Yeah, so you can find me on my website, somaiyabooks.com, on Twitter as Somaiya Daud, and then on Instagram, Somaiya with 3 I's.
Okay. And I'll spell your name for listeners. Somaiya, and last name Daud.
Yep.
That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No. If you were interested and like this conversation, you should definitely read Mirage and pre-order Court of Lions, which is out August 4th, 2020.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a really good time.
Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, please subscribe to it and rate it and review it if possible. I have many other options to geek out on sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, whether you prefer books, movies, TV, video games, anime, or whatever you choose. You can find links to interesting videos on my Facebook page, Full Contact Nerd. You can find links to interesting news articles and academic studies on my Twitter page, Full Contact Nerd. You can find cosplay model and convention photos on my Instagram page, Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi. You can find my interview videos on my YouTube page, Full Contact Nerd. You can also sign up for my newsletter at chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. In the newsletter, I post additional video and news links, as well as regular updates on new, nerd-friendly fiction and nonfiction books being published. Please remember, my name Chris does not have an H. C-R-I-S. Thank you for listening, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.